The darkest candy flip, a rupture from reality, an LSD and MDMA trip report by the Epic Mundane, posted to earwid.org February 22nd, 2023. Note: I've chosen to use pseudonyms rather than just initials when it comes to naming the individuals mentioned in this post, because I think names read better, and this trip report involves quite a large cast of characters. This trip report describes what was easily the worst night of my life. A full-blown psychotic episode, a train wreck, a disaster trip. That being said, it was still an invaluable learning experience, and over the following months I was able to use the lessons learned during this experience to reach a better, fuller understanding of myself, as well as my own psyche and my place in the world. In the final analysis, I'm actually glad that I went through this, but I certainly did not feel that way at the time. In early March of this year, a few weeks after my 23rd birthday, I experienced my first truly bad trip, which I would term a drug-induced psychosis. Myself and a group of friends had gone to an outdoor psytrance party, held on a farm just outside of town. My friend Bella had just acquired a vial of liquid LSD, and we were all very excited to trip together at this party. Note: this would be my 4th time tripping on acid. I'm also very experienced with MDMA, methadone, psilocybin, 4-ACO-DMT, 5-MeO-DIPT, and several other psychoactives. When we arrived, at around 11 PM, we immediately went to the bathroom to dose up. I asked Bella for 2 drops, approximately 300 micrograms. I'd had 3 drops, approximately 450 micrograms before, but I had never tripped on acid in such a public space before, and wanted to play it safe. However, as she was administering the LSD, her hand slipped, and I ended up with way more acid under my tongue than I bargained for, closer to 5 or 6 drops, 750 to 900 micrograms worth. Bella was horrified, and I was understandably apprehensive as well. But there wasn't all that much to be done about it, and I considered retreating to a safer place and waiting out the trip at home, but I'd been looking forward to this night for ages, and I was curious to see how I would handle such an unexpectedly large dose. Not very well, as it happens. About half an hour later, I started to come up hard. Visuals were extremely pronounced. Thousands of tiny little spheres of multicoloured light began to dance across my vision, and people's faces began to warp and stretch. Conversation became increasingly difficult, and I began to feel as if there was no connection between the words in my head and the words coming out of my mouth. I also began to feel an extreme physical discomfort. Tweaky is the word I would use to describe the sensation. I went and danced for a little bit, which helped me distract myself from the comfort, but I was finding the whole experience distinctly unenjoyable. I then ran into my friend Kyle, who was also tripping, and I told him I was having a bit of a rough time. We walked around the party for a bit, chatting in a disjointed fashion, and this made me feel a little bit better. At that point, I suddenly remembered that in my wallet were 2 150mg caps of MDMA. I had them left over from my birthday, and in my acid-addled state, it seemed like a brilliant idea to take them there and then, despite Kyle's objections. Now, here we go. This was yet another big mistake of mine. I went to dance some more and started feeling really, really good. Better than I'd ever felt before. The music was face-meltingly incredible. Every slight movement I made sent ripples of pleasure all through my body. Everyone around me seemed blindingly beautiful. About an hour after I took the MDMA, I decided to take a break, get some water, and went to sit by the bonfire, where I ended up running into my friend Rosie, beautiful soul who I'd had a massive crush on ever since I first met her last year. We started chatting, and I basically blurted out my feelings for her on the spot. She seemed taken aback, but pleased, and we actually ended up kissing for a bit. Things were taking a turn for the better, but then the incoherency that I'd been battling all night came back with a vengeance, and said some very inappropriate and hurtful things to her, completely unintentionally, and she became very hurt, confused, and overall extremely angry with me. Now, it's at this point that the trip took a truly dark turn, and my recollection of things beyond that point is still very scattered and incomplete. I ran away from her, back into the mass of bodies on the dance floor, and became overwhelmed by terrible, uncontrollable feelings of desire. Everything and everyone around me took on a very sexual aspect. I started touching, rubbing up on, and kissing everyone around me. Obviously this didn't go down very well with anyone. Not that I noticed or cared at the time though. Kyle and Bella saw what was happening and tried to drag me away, but I ran away from them into the darkness. I ended up backstage and, for whatever reason, decided to climb onto the roof of a large freight container and throw myself off of it. I landed face down in the dirt, breaking my glasses in the process. A couple of witnesses told me afterwards that I lay still there for a very long time. About 10 to 15 minutes they said I was out for, and I think I may have actually sustained a mild concussion from the fall. Eventually, one of the organisers of the party found me and took me to the chill-out tent, and he tried to contain me and calm me down. My memories of this time are very fragmented. I remember lying on an old beat-up couch, pushing my fingers into holes in the couch and being very aroused by this. I even remember people's faces morphing and warping around me. Total strangers turned into childhood friends. Men turned into women. Friends and acquaintances turned into celebrities and pop culture icons. It was as if every time I blinked, I was transported into a totally different reality with totally different rules. At one point, I became convinced that to solve the world's energy crisis, we needed a second sun, and that I had the power to will this sun into existence. At another, I remember being given water to drink and then believing that I was drinking whole oceans dry, swallowing rain clouds, draining seas, sucking the whole world dry to quench my terrible thirst. A second later, I hallucinated that I was surrounded by silverback gorillas. The whole time, apparently I was raving and talking non-stop gibberish. What's important to note, however, is that this whole time during the psychotic part of the trip, I didn't feel fearful or anxious or anything like that. On the contrary, I was consumed by an overpowering, awe-inspiring sense of wonder and joy. It was as if I was so happy that my brain couldn't cope with it, and happiness itself was driving me insane. So eventually, sometime past sunrise, someone managed to feed me an antipsychotic, chlorpromazine, I think, and someone else managed to call my flatmate to come take me home. Once I was finally back in my bedroom, reality began to return to me bit by bit, and I slowly began to realise just how fucked up that night had been. I was sobering up, but still tripping, and that was when I entered into the most hellish and nightmarish part of the entire trip. I lay in bed, sobbing my eyes out, as a multitude of demonic-looking worms and centipedes and other crawling vermin slithered and swarmed all over me, enveloping me in slimy darkness. I puked all over myself, pissed my pants several times, and unable to even drag myself to the bathroom to clean myself up. I remember looking at my hands and seeing the flesh begin to blacken and wither until the skin slid off my body and all that was left was yellowing bone. At that moment, still in the grip of the monstrous Candyflip, but sober enough to realise just how badly fucked up things had gone, I had hit rock bottom, and for the first time in my life, found myself contemplating suicide. I finally managed to cry myself to sleep at around 10 AM. The next few weeks were very, very difficult. I fell into a deep depression, obsessed by feelings of stupidity, shame, and remorse over what had happened. Fortunately, my friends were very understanding and supportive of me, and with their help, I was able to get my shit back together and carry on with normal life. I tripped on acid once more in the months that followed that night, mushrooms twice, and had 2 MDMA rolls, but no combos. And everything went pretty smoothly for the most part. I wanted to prove to myself that I was not permanently insane, and that I could still enjoy these substances despite what had happened to me that night. Nevertheless, the memory of that night remained like a scar in my consciousness, and I felt acute anxiety and shame whenever I thought about it or someone brought it up. Over the following few months, with the help of therapy, the support of my friends, and a few more quite revelatory drug experiences, primarily involving MDMA and methadone, I was able to take a lot of positive things from this bad trip, and as I said at the start of the report, it taught me a lot about myself and my place in this world, and I'm honestly grateful for those lessons, even though I wish they hadn't come to me in such a terrifying manner. I won't go into the details here, because this is a trip report and not a personal psychological evaluation, but the main point I want to get across is that every trip, good or bad, contains within it the possibility for personal growth and development. The Bad Candyflip, an MDMA and LSD trip report by Scotto, posted to Irwid.org, June 21st, 2000. Most people report the Candyflip of LSD plus MDMA combination to be a very enjoyable experience. The most rewardingly cosmic aspects of the LSD are combined with the empathogenic love of the MDMA to create this unique and often powerful experience. This is usually the case with me as well, provided I take a low dose of LSD with a regular dose of MDMA, i.e. too much LSD can blow the MDMA out of the water, which is a damn waste of MDMA, let me tell you. However, I feel obliged to report one very negative experience I had during a Candyflip many years ago, when I was still living in Cedar Falls, Iowa. This report mainly serves to underscore the importance of set and setting, but also stands as a reminder that, as Alexander Shulgin says, there are no insignificant psychedelic experiences, meaning caution is always a great policy. I was hoping to do a rather deep exploration that night, and had invited my good friend H over to sit for me. His instructions were to sit quietly in the same room as me and intercede only if I really encountered problems. I felt that this was a reasonable precaution, because this was only my second Candyflip, and I was still at that time relatively experienced with both LSD and MDMA. I didn't expect trouble, as I was feeling good and confident about myself at the time, but I figured it wouldn't hurt to have H around, someone who knew me very well and could handle me if I got into a bad space at all. At the time, I was writing a book called Melody's Blues, and felt pretty involved with some of the characters, to the extent that my psychedelic trips often featured interactions with versions of these characters. I laid down on the floor under a nice blanket on top of some cushions underneath a blindfold, and proceeded to go way, way out there, man, and suddenly found myself sharing a psychedelic bubble of space-time with Melody, the main character in the book. This was not in itself cause for alarm, but before long, things got incredibly dark and incredibly weird inside my head. The sensation was of being suddenly and vigorously pursued by vast collections of entities that were very specifically bent on doing us grievous harm. We fled through psychedelic corridors and churning maelstroms of energy, and the terror in me gradually increased over the course of what I'm guessing was only half an hour, but maybe more. The intensity continued to build, and it seemed extremely relentless. I could feel them shrieking as they chased us, these horrible alien monsters. I had never encountered such mayhem before, and was honestly frightened beyond any belief. At some point, it somehow finally occurred to me to rip the blindfold off and sit up. Thankfully, the room was just as I left it, if covered with a few more multicoloured swirls than usual. I immediately turned to H, who was staring intently at me. I said, "What the hell is going on here?" "Well, you ingested LSD and MDMA, and I reckon you've been candy flipping for about an hour and a half or so," he said. And then he fell silent, and suddenly I heard for the first time the sounds coming from the apartment next door. My neighbours had been having a horrendous, extremely loud fight, and the screams were clearly audible through the wall. These sounds had very obviously penetrated my trip, but hadn't given any external signs that I was in trouble, so H had chosen not to intervene. The aggression from next door was as much a part of my set and setting as my preparation and intention, and had pretty much steered my entire trip. We waited a long time, H and I, until the sounds finally died down. I was very shaken by my exposure to such violent energy, and wasn't sure how to proceed. Eventually though, I put on some incredibly soothing music and laid back down, and within minutes was sucked back into a very peaceful and magical place, about which I have written elsewhere.